The Organic Machine by Richard White. Introduction. The Columbia River has borne fewer books than barges, but its burden has been great enough so that yet another one, even one as short as this, demands justification. This is a little book with large ambitions. It is about a particular river, a stunningly beautiful river, and the people who have changed it. But it does not approach the river in the usual way. I want to examine the river as an organic machine, as an energy system which, although modified by human interventions, maintains its natural, its quote-unquote unmade qualities. I emphasize energy because energy is such a protean and useful concept. The flow of the river is energy. So is the electricity that comes from the dams that block the flow. Human labor is energy. So are the calories stored as fat by salmon for their journey upstream. Seen one way, energy is an abstraction. Seen another, it is as concrete as salmon, human bodies, and the Grand Coulee Dam. I will measure this book's success by the extent to which it surprises its readers, catches them off guard, and forces them to think in new ways, not merely about the Columbia, but about nature and its relation to human beings and human history. My argument in this book is that we cannot understand human history without natural history, and we cannot understand natural history without human history. The two have been intertwined for millennia. As I have gotten into middle age, history has seemed less and less about things or ideas or individual persons, and more about relationships, construct, and a set of actual things outside of us and not fully contained by our constructions, needs to be put into human history. Nature, to paraphrase Donald Worster, is salmon swimming, the river flowing, and I would add, humans fishing. In aiming for a relationship, I mean to do more than write a human history alongside a natural history and call it an environmental history. This would be like writing a biography of a wife, placing it alongside the biography of a husband and calling it the history of marriage. I want the history of the relationship itself. What I have stressed are qualities that humans and the Columbia River share: energy and work. I do not deny the huge differences between human work and the work of nature. I do not attribute either a consciousness or a purpose to nature. Human work and the work of nature. I do not attribute either a consciousness or a purpose to nature. I do argue that it is our work that ultimately links us, for better or worse, to nature. One of the great shortcomings, intellectual and political, of modern environmentalism is its failure to grasp how human beings have historically known nature through work. Environmentalists, for all their love of nature, tend to distance humans from it. Environmentalists stress the I over the hand, the contemplative over the active, the supposedly undisturbed over the connected. They call for human connections with nature, while disparaging all those who claim to have known and appreciated nature through work and labor. On a more mundane level, I came to this book with a dual fascination. I have long been intrigued by both salmon. I first came to know salmon years ago with Indian gill netters on the Nisqually River. The Nisqually knew salmon by catching them. They taught me, although I was too dim to recognize it then, how nature can be known through labor. My fascination with dams began the first time I saw a turbine room of a big dam. It was so obviously a human creation, and yet, paradoxically, there was virtually no visible human presence. The interior of a dam is an eerie place. The turbines turn in the unseen river. The generators produce electricity. A dam seems a piece of ghost technology. This, of course, is not true. Humans supervise the whole immense structure. Without human maintenance, the machinery would freeze up and cease to function. The dam would begin to self-destruct. Being fascinated by both being fascinated by both salmon and dams, and appreciative of the virtues of each, I have tried to write this book in quite conscious opposition to modern reductionisms. The reductions of the natural world to property, the reductions of action to discourse, of life to the market, of the great changing and multifarious planet to a stable and harmonious nature. This is a book which seeks to blur boundaries, emphasize impurity, and find, paradoxically, along those blurred and dirty boundaries, ways to better live with our dilemmas. What this book suggests is that if we want to understand what we have done and how we have acted in nature, we might, in John Muir, we might want to look for the natural in the dams and the unnatural in the salmon. The boundaries between the human and the natural have existed only to be crossed on the river. Chapter 1. Knowing Nature Through Labor. Energy, Salmon Society on the Columbia River. Part 1. The world is in motion. Tectonic plates drift across a spinning planet. Mountains are lifted up and eroded into the sea. Glaciers advance and retreat. All natural features move, but few natural features move so obviously as rivers. Our metaphors for rivers are all metaphors of movement. They run and roll and flow. Like us, rivers work. They absorb. Like us, rivers work. They absorb and emit energy. They rearrange the world. The Columbia has been working for millennia. During the Miocene, volcanic eruptions deposited layers of basalt across the Columbia Plain. The Upper Columbia cut was a gutter through which it ran along the margins of the basaltic flow. At Wenatchee, the rise of Horse Heaven anticline caused the river to cut into the basalt. It drained into the Pasco Basin, the lowest point on its route east of the Cascades, and emerged from the basin at the Wallula Gap. During the Pleistocene, the collapse of the ice dam holding glacial Lake Missoula in Earth's history. It was an afternoon's work for one of the Missoula floods to create the Grand Coulee and other rock channels of the channeled scablands. In those few hours, it accomplished work that it would have taken the Mississippi 300 years at full flood to duplicate. The flood rushed into the Columbia Channel and finally slowed enough to create the Portland Delta of the Willamette Lowlands. Since then, ice dams have blocked the Columbia's bed, temporarily spilling the river into the Grand Coulee. Mountains have slid into it, and humans have dammed it. All these changes have left work for the river to do. For much of human history, work and energy have linked humans and rivers, humans and nature. But today, except when disaster strikes, when a hurricane hits, or earthquakes topple our creations, or when a river unexpectedly rises and sweeps away the results of our efforts and labor, we forget the awesome power, the energy of nature. There is little in our day-to-day life to preserve the connection. Machines do most of our work. We disparage physical labor and laborers. The link between our work and nature's work has weakened. We no longer understand the world through labor. Once the energy of the Columbia River was felt in human bones and sinews, human beings knew the river through the work the river demanded of them. Early 19th century accounts of the Columbia can be read in many ways, but they are certainly all accounts of work, sweat, exhaustion, and fear. The men of the early 19th century who wrote the Lewis and Clark journals, the accounts of the Astorian Trading Post, the Northwest Company, and Hudson Bay Company knew the energy of the river. They had to expend their own energy to move up, down, and across it. Alexander Ross's marvelous Adventures of the First Settlers on the Oregon or Columbia River, a narrative of the arrival of the Astorians and the establishment of the fur trading outposts of Astoria in 1811, can serve as a primer on the Columbia as an energy system during a time when human beings, Indian and white, had only the wind and the strength of their muscles to match against the powerful currents of the river. The mouth of the Columbia River, Ross wrote, is remarkable for its sandbars and high surf at all seasons, but more particularly in the spring and fall during the equinoctial gales. The shoals and sandbars at the Columbia's mouth are relics of its work and energy. In areas without strong tidal action, a river deposits the load it carries to its mouth as a delta, but the Columbia emerges into the Pacific in an area of strong tides and persistent storms. The river's currents and the tides battle at the Columbia's mouth and prevent the formation of a delta. At full flood, Captain Charles Wilkes wrote in 1841, one could, quote, scarcely have an idea of its flow, how swollen it is, and to see huge trunks of thick, gigantic forest borne like chips on its bosom astonishes one, unquote. During ebb tides, the river pushes its fresh water out many miles into the sea. The tides, in turn, are felt as high as 140 miles upriver when the Columbia water level is at its fall and winter low. The pushing and pulling produces a set of sandbars and islands at the river's mouth. Ocean currents and tides force themselves against the bars with huge waves and foam breakers. The result is a white foaming sheet for many miles, both south and north on the mouth of the river, forming, as it were, an impractical barrier to the entrance and threatening with instant destruction everything that comes near it. To enter the river, and aided by the tide, or boats and canoes powered by human muscle, had to pass through this barrier. During the Astorians' own terrible entry into the Columbia in 1811, they sent out small boats to find a channel into the river for their ship, the Tonquin. In Ross's dramatic telling, the Astorians watched as the Tonquin's first officer, Ebenezer Fox, protested to Captain Jonathan Thorne that the seas were too high for any boat to live in. In reply, Thorne only taunted Fox, "Mr. Fox, if you are afraid of water, you should have remained at Boston." Fox's uncle had died at the mouth of the Columbia. In despair, Fox announced that he was going to lay my bones with his. He shook hands with the Astorians and, getting onto the boat, shouted, "Farewell, my friends, we will perhaps meet again in the next world." Fox's crew was inexperienced and the sea violent. Not 100 yards from the ship, the boat became unmanageable. The waves hit the craft broadside, whirled it like a top, and tossing it on the crest of a huge wave, it would sink again for a time and disappear altogether. Fox hoisted a flag to signal his distress, but the Tonquin turned about, and they saw the ill-fated boat no more. Ross himself took part in a second attempt, and he discovered more immediately the experiences of pitting human energy against the energy focused at the mouth of the river. As they first approached the bar with its terrific chain of breakers, the fearful suction or current gripped the boat, before they realized what had happened. The second officer, Mr. Mumford, called, "For your lives, pull hard, or you are all dead men." They pulled hard and survived, but this attempt to enter the river and two more failed. The Tonquin eventually made the passage across the bar, but only after 8 men had died. In their ordeal at the bar, the Astorians had confronted storms, sandbars, and currents. Men had labored and died, but the wave, water, and wind and human labor can be represented in ways beyond the immediacy of actual experience. We can abstract them to a single entity, energy. There is a physics to the Tonquin's drama at the river's mouth, and it leads outward beyond the earth to the sun and the moon. Lunar gravitation causes the tides, but virtually all the rest of the energy manifests at the Columbia mouth or originates in the sun. The sun, in effect, provides fuel for a giant atmospheric heat engine, which evaporates water from the oceans and produces wind that move the moisture over land. And the clouds cool. The moisture falls as rain. Without solar energy to move the water inland and uphill, rivers would never begin. Without gravity to propel the water downhill, back toward the ocean, rivers would never flow. In a real sense, the Columbia begins everywhere that the rain that eventually enters it falls. The Columbia gathers its water from an area of 258,200 square miles, but not all the water finds its way into the river as it flows. 1,214 miles its way into the river as it flows 1,214 miles to the sea. Some of it is lost through transportation and the use in plant tissue. Some is lost through evaporation. Physicists define energy as the capacity to do work. Work, in turn, is the product of a force acting on a body and the distance the body is moved in the direction of the force. Push a large rock, and you're expending energy in doing work. The amount of each depends on how large the rock and how far you push it. The weight and flow of water produces the energy and allows rivers to do work of moving rock and soil. The greater the volume of water in the river and the steeper the gradient of its bed, the greater its potential energy. In fact, however, neither Columbia nor other river realizes potential energy results in work. The erosion, transportation, and deposition of matter. About 98% of the river's kinetic energy is expended in friction as the moving water rubs against itself, its bed, and its bank. The energy is dissipated as heat within the river. Engineers can measure the potential energy and the kinetic energy of the Columbia with some precision, but early voyagers like Ross recognized the power, the energy, by more immediate, if cruder measures. They measured it by the damage it did as it threw ships or boats or bodies against rocks or sandbars, and they measured it by the work they had to perform to counter the river's work. They knew something we have obscured and are only slowly recovering. Labor, rather than quote-unquote conquering nature, involves human beings with the world so thoroughly that they can never be disentangled. During the 42 days of Ross's first trip upriver from Astoria, the river demonstrated its power again and again. The river upset the Astorians' boat. It dunked the men, drenched them, grounded them, and delayed them. But mostly, the river made them work, sweat, and hurt. On the 3rd day of the month, we started stemming a strong and almost irresistible current. The current assumed double force, so that our paddles provided almost ineffectual and to get on, we were obliged to drag ourselves from point to point by laying hold of bushes and branches of overhanging trees. The burning sun of yesterday, and the difficulty of stemming the overhanging trees. The burning sun of yesterday, and the difficulty of stemming the rapid current, had so reduced our strength, and that we made but little headway today. We were again early at work, making the best of our way against a turbulent and still increasing current. Ross had reached the Cascades, the rapids where the Columbia bursts out of the mountains above the Cascades, were even worse rapids at the Dalles, and the Dalles commenced with Celilo Falls. Here the current was too strong, and travelers had to portage. About Celilo Falls, Ross's litany of labor continued. The current was strong and rapid the whole day. We found the current so powerful that we had to lay our lines. The winds springing up, we hoisted sails, but found the experiment dangerous, owing to the rapidity of the current. And so they proceeded through Priest Rapids, where the water rushes with great violence, and through lesser rapids, where a whirlpool grabbed a boat, spun it several times, and sent it careening down a chain of cascades. Ross stopped at the Okanagan River. If he had gone farther, more rapids awaited, Kettle Falls, and still farther, the Dalles de Mort. The largest tributaries of the Columbia, the Snake and the Willamette, contributed falls and rapids of their own. So thoroughly did Ross come to measure the difficulty by the labor he pitted against it, by the feel of his body, by the difficulties it presented, that his retreat speeding him back to Astoria from Fort Okanagan could be contained in one sentence. On the 26th of February, we began our homeward journey and spent just 25 days on our way back. With so much energy deployed against them, it was remarkable that the voyagers could proceed at all. The first white fur traders built what they called canoes out of cedar planks caulked with gum. Such boats could not stand the rapids. The Astorians longed for another Indian technology, the more familiar birch bark canoes of the eastern rivers. The Northwesterners who succeeded the Astorians actually imported the birch bark necessary to make birch bark canoes. Efficient movement on the river demanded not just muscle power, but the knowledge of art. The fur traders, fortunately, had examples of both before them. In the Indian cedar canoes, efficiency and art met and became one. The Indians carved each of their canoes from a single log. Gabriel Francher, another one of the original Astorians, reported that the large canoes were 30 feet long and 5 feet wide. And Robert Stewart, also an Astorian, wrote, If perfect symmetry, smoothness, and proportion constitute beauty, they surpass anything I ever beheld. Some were as transparent as oiled paper. The art and knowledge embodied in the canoe demanded an equal knowledge of the river. Lewis and Clark were repeatedly amazed at the conditions Indians ventured out in, and William Clark had thought them the best canoe navigators I ever saw. Stewart concurred. The Indians were the most expert paddlemen any of us had ever seen. If the river overpowered their canoe, they would spring into the water, more like amphibious animals than human beings, rightly and empty her, when with the great composure, then they again get in and proceed. But the clearest mark of knowledge and skill was when nothing happened, and Indians knew which paths through the river were the most efficient and least demanding of human energy. The river's lessons that the Astorians learned the Northwest Company men would have to relearn the property of the boats and the inability to maneuver them that the governor-in-chief of the Hudson Bay Company, George Simpson, found on the first voyage of inspection to the Columbia 24 provoked a spluttering astonishment that still resonates in his journal. "There is not," he wrote, "a boat at the establishment, Fort George, fit to cross the river in bad weather, nor a person competent to sail one." Simpson's attempt to cross in a boat with rotten rigging that proceeded only a mile before everyone on board was bailing with hats and buckets. The boat struck a sandbar and drifted off, and the crew rowing madly against an outgoing tide until they exhausted their strength at the oars. They were only saved when the tide turned and swept them back into the river, where they made shore, abandoned the boat, and walked back to the fort. Farther up river, however, where Canadian boatmen were more in their element, the British nationalist David Douglas could in 1826 admire, quote, "the indescribable coolness with which the Canadians shot the rapids." The Canadians showed Douglas that the knowledge of how and where to use the boats was important as the boats themselves. The complexities of the energy systems of the river could be made to work for as well as against travelers. "Our Indians," the American explorer Charles Wilkes wrote in 1841, "cunningly kept close to the shore and thus took advantage of all the eddies." Such knowledge was initially a bodily knowledge felt even when learned from others. The messages sent through nerve and muscle constantly validated or modified acquired knowledge. Knowledge of the river was in large part knowing how its velocity varied and where it was turbulent. With proper experience, traveling against the current on the Columbia demanded less expenditure of human energy than traveling over land. The hydraulics of the river sketched out a map of energy. This geography of energy was also a geography of labor. George Simpson saw the world with the eyes of an adventurous accountant. He gauged rivers as he judged his men and the Indians by the work they did, the expense they required, and the profit the company might derive from them. In 1824, on first entering the Columbia he found the current of the Columbia so strong that the first sight of one scarcely suppose it possible to stem it even with the tow line. But on more attentive observation, it is found that every reach there is a strong back current or eddy which renders it easy of ascent. The Columbia, as Simpson noted, does not travel at constant speed along its bed. Friction divides its very current against itself. It divides it horizontally. Where the water meets earth and rock along the river's bed and banks, friction slows the current. Velocity increases from the shore. Varies vertically. The river, in effect, is composed of layers. It is the fluid equivalent of a piece of plywood, but in the river's case, each layer moves at a different velocity. The layer of greatest velocity is always below the surface. With a constant depth of flow, velocity increases and toward the center of the river and rises toward the surface. With the where the channel is asymmetrical, maximum velocity shifts toward the deeper side. As Simpson noticed, the very velocity of the river created other compensatory effects that reduced human labor. Water, as a fluid, cannot resist stress. When the river's velocity reaches a certain point, the flow becomes turbulent. The layers mix. The flow at some point eddies back. The layers mix. The flow at some point eddies back against the main current. The velocities of the river changes across both space and time. When the volume of water increases in spring and summer with melting snows from the mountains, friction does not increase proportionately. The area of bank and steam bed increases by a much smaller increment than does the volume of water. When deep and full, rivers run faster than when shallow. Thus, the velocity of the Columbia increases in the spring and summer, and it increases the farther one goes downstream. As every voyager on the river knew, it was not just the speed that created turbulence. The flow of a river also depended on the roughness of its bed. Obstructions in the channel, rocks and boulders, trees or piers, separate its flow and create eddies. Eddies create the waves, vortices, and surges that characterize rapids. And the Columbia possessed some of the fiercest and largest rapids on the continent. The places on the Columbia marked by the greatest turbulence and velocity formed a gauntlet through which voyagers had to pass. Roughly 800 years ago, a 3-mile chunk of Table Mountain fell into the river, blocking it entirely. Stand at Bonneville Dam, and you can see the gash it left on the mountain, 150 miles from its mouth. The river of edge forming the Cascades. Robert Stewart describes the current as that of mill sluice, and so rough that the ocean agitated by a tempest would be a faint comparison. Roughly 40 miles above the Cascades came the Dalles, or Long Narrows, where a basalt flow constricted the Columbia. Narrowing the channel increased the velocity of the Columbia in the same way that partially blocking the outlet of a horse with your thumb increases the water's velocity. In the words of David Thompson, a Northwest companyman, who probably knew the continent more intimately than any other human alive, the walls of rock contract the river from 800 to 1,000 yards in width to 60 yards or less. Imagination can hardly feel of water under such compression, raging and hissing as if alive. To William Clark, it was an agitated, gut-swelling, boiling and whirling in every direction. At full flood, the river rose high up the narrow gorge. David Douglas saw tree trunks 3 feet in diameter on the rocks, 43 feet above the present level, placed there by the water. Just as compression increased speed and energy, so did gravity when the incline of the river's bed steepened. Immediately above the Dalles, at Celilo Falls, cascading water increased in velocity and thus increased the amount of kinetic energy it produced. At these places where the river narrowed and or fell in a short distance, the river's energy was great. Falls and rapids yielded disproportionate depth to those inexperienced at handling boats or cedar canoes, or those who chose risk over the labor of portage. There was, however, danger no matter how great the skill of the paddlers. The early accounts of missionaries provide a grim narrative of the dangers of rivers. The water being very high and the current strong, wrote the Methodist Elijah White's prologue to an 1843 accident in which a canoe carrying 4 whites and 4 Indians was swept over the Willamette Falls on the Willamette River. A hope effort to battle the current, a thrilling shriek from Mrs. Rogers, and the victims were gone. 2 Indians jumped and survived. Everyone else died. 5 years earlier, an Indian canoe carrying missionaries attempted to run the Cascades and overturned. When it was righted and brought to shore, the Indian crew found the dead body of the drowned infant son of Mrs. Elijah White in the canoe. A short time earlier, a Hudson Bay canoe with 7 men was lost at the same place. It took only bad luck, a moment's panic, or a lapse of skill for the river to claim its toll. The Dallas de Mort of the Columbia received its name in 1820 when the river had wrecked a Hudson Bay Company's party, killing 5 men and reducing 1 survivor to cannibalism. Near the Dallas proper, 9 men drowned in 1830, and on a fetch of river not considered especially dangerous. And in 1842, Father Pierre de Smet, who described the Columbia as but a succession of dangers, washed in horror as what appears to have been a whirlpool rapids near Calican Falls swallowed a Hudson Bay Company's bateau, drowning 5 bargemen. These rapids and falls created the most revealing places on the earth. They were critical sites in a geography of energy, and they were critical places in the social, cultural, and political geography humans constructed. A scholar needs to consider them at least as carefully and from as many angles as a boatman preparing to run them. And now we understand rivers. As we now understand rivers, they seek the most efficient and uniform expenditure of energy possible. Rivers constantly adjust. They compensate for events that affect them. They are historical products of their own past history. The river channel, concluded one geomorphologist, is a form representing the most efficient, in terms of energy utilization, geometry capable of accommodating the sum total of the means and extremes of variability of flow that have occurred in the channel throughout its history. Where obstacles slow rivers try to restore an even velocity. Where the gradient increases or the channel constricts, rivers try to widen or build up their bed. The Columbia ceaselessly worked to widen the Dallas, and it responded to Celilo Falls by working to downcut the falls and erode the plunge pools until the falls themselves eventually would even out and disappear. When an obstacle such as a beaver dam or a hydraulic current, for example, its speed and energy decrease, the river drops part of its load, the material it works to move. It gradually builds up its own bed and increases its gradient, thus increasing its speed and kinetic energy. In the long run, the river's work of eliminating obstructions aids the human work of moving up and down rivers. But in the short run, rapids and falls demand greater expenditures of human energy to counter the river's energy. This combination of energies bonded the material and social. The natural and cultural intertwined. The geography of energy intersected quite tightly with a geography of danger and a human geography of labor. Precisely where the river expended its greatest energy, humans had to expend the most labor and confront the greatest danger. At the falls and rapids, travelers had to portage. Indians living at the Cascades had canoes at either end of the portages, but travelers had to carry their cargo and either tow or carry their boat. It was hard and demanding work. Portaging the Cascades brought Lewis and Clark much difficulty and labor, cost them a pirogue, and left their men so much fatigued that they granted them a respite. The missionary Mrs. Elijah White, whose baby drowned at the Cascades, had gladly re-embarked 2/3 through the portage because she and David Leslie, with their feet and fatigue, were very uncomfortable. Going upstream, everyone hit the portage. Going downstream, danger could be substituted for labor. The Cascades and the Dalles were the most dangerous points on the river and the longest portages. At the Cascades, which one of the literary historians described as the rocky and dangerous portage, the laborious task of carrying made clear the distinction between the work of the river and the work of the human beings. In one sense, the expenditure of energy by human workers was as natural as the energy of the river, but human work was socially organized and given cultural meaning. The Cascades and the Dalles, for example, bared class divisions among the historians and revealed their relation to work and power. Ross, not being accustomed myself to carry, instead stood armed as a sentimental against the Indians, but with those subordinate to him, wearied to death, he took up a load. The first ascent left him breathless and able to proceed no farther. He hired an Indian to carry the load, and the Indian proceeded full trot across the portage, only to pitch the pack of tobacco over a 200-foot precipice at the end. He and 50 others laughed uproariously as Ross scrambled to retrieve the load. The joke was about work and power, weakness and dominance, all of which were physical and social. The river demanded energy to match its energy, and this shaped and revealed the organization of work, the necessity of portages, and the limits of human labor caused by the Hudson Bay Company to transport all its goods in 90-pound packages. The expenditure of labor in carrying these packages involved numerous acts of calculation, conflict, abuse, and cooperation. In these acts, a social order became transparent. If all journeys were downstream, if there had been no rapids or falls, then human relations on the early 19th century river would have been different. The labor white men expended in the ascent forced them into close contact with Indians. The knowledge that in passing upstream they had to travel close to the shore to take advantage of back currents encouraged efforts to accommodate Indians. David Thompson, the remarkable Northwest Company explorer who descended the Columbia just as the historians were arriving at its mouth, succinctly calculated the social result of this mix of river energy and human labor when he explained why he stopped to smoke and exchange gifts with the Sempoils as he passed downstream. My reason for putting ashore and smoking with the natives is to make friends with them against my return, for in descending the current of a large river, we might pass on without much attention to them, but in returning against the current, our progress will be slow and close along the shore, and consequently very much in their power, whereas staying a few hours and smoking with them while explaining to them the object of my voyage makes them friendly to us. Passage along the river was, Thompson realized, not just physical, it was social and political. Social and political rituals were as necessary as labor to move against the current. Indians expected gifts and ritual at the portages. The failure of whites to meet such expectations brought conflict from a time of Lewis and Clark expedition until the 1820s. In English, the words energy and power have become virtually interchangeable. Horsepower is, for example, a technical measure of energy, but we also speak metaphorically of the power of the state. Thompson spoke of being in the power of the Indians. The conflation is partially metaphorical, but also arises because both meanings involve the ability to do work, to command labor. To be powerful is to be able to accomplish things and to be able to turn the energy and work of nature and humans to your own purposes. We conflate energy and power, the natural and the cultural, in language, but they are equally mixed as social fact at the rapids and portages. The energy systems of the Columbia determined where humans would portage, but human labor created the actual route of the portations, determines its final social form and outcome. The Dalles, per se, did not cause Ross's dilemma. Ross's humiliation was an incident of power. Human labor would later take the Dalles and the Cascades, the sites of the dams that produced energy. Power. They were, however, long before this, sites at which humans contested over social power, the ability to gain advantage from the labor of others. Spatial arrangements matter a great deal in human history. They reveal the social arrangements that help produce them. The repeated conflicts at the Dalles and the Cascades revolved around a particular organization of space. Whites regarded the space at the Cascades and the Dalles as open, as culturally empty. Indians regarded it as full. In a space that brought together many different peoples, Indians expected gifts to mediate and smooth passages through the social maze. Too often, whites replaced gifts with force. They resented what they perceived as theft and pillage. The space became uniquely violent.